Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is a very exciting conference for us to participate in because it's such a giant genealogist hub. And we are very happy to be here to represent the Texas Digital Newspaper Program from the portal to Texas history. My name is Ana Krahmer, and I am the director of the Digital Newspaper Program. And I have here my colleague Tim Geringer, who works on creating metadata records for TDNP. The Texas Digital Newspaper Program, or TDNP, hosts nearly 13 million newspaper pages and is the largest continually growing single state open access gateways to newspapers in the US. The TDNP hosts over 2,000 newspaper titles spanning from 1813 to the present, and I'll show you in a minute why 1813, because Texas, of course, wasn't a state yet. We host from over 239 partners representing 211 Texas counties, and we're always working to continue to expand those numbers. We're always growing and always adding more items. To find us, you'll visit texashistory.unt.edu, and in another room, you'll hear my colleague Jake Mangum talk more about the other materials on the portal Texas History beyond just the Texas Digital Newspaper Program, and he will show you what those entail. The newspapers that we host are from across the state of Texas. Our mission is to digitally preserve and build access to any newspaper from any location or time in Texas. Now, if you look, the darker blue regions of the map, of course, represent a much darker, more newspapers available. And then the gray areas mean that there are no newspapers from those counties. Now, if you are from any of these counties in Texas or have ancestors from there, please don't hesitate to contact me. I do have my email address at the end of this presentation, and I would really like to hear from you. Newspapers we receive are through partnerships with groups from across Texas, including public libraries, museums, historical and genealogical societies, universities, government agencies, private collections, and school libraries, for instance, high school libraries. These basically are a contribution to build from the community effort to build this massive collection. So TDNP, while Tim and I are staff members who work for TDNP, we are actually just the faces of the people who are working behind the scenes to make this happen. And a lot of the Texas Digital Newspaper Program is built through the generous donations and efforts of partners and private collectors and foundations from across Texas. Now, before I move forward, I just wanted to mention, just beware that the Texas Digital Newspaper Program does host content that's over 200 years old, and these do represent different ideas and opinions than what we represent today, and they do not reflect the values of TD&P, the portal, or UNT. But we don't censor our collection because we do believe that preserving the accurate historical record is very important to enable our researchers to understand and analyze the history and the context. So I mentioned 1813, and Texas is so big, we have a lot of populations below 50,000, and as a result, we have a lot of grant agencies who support communities to digitize their newspapers that are below 50,000. These include the Talker Foundation, who funds newspaper grants for populations under 12,000 or for Texas county libraries, and the Hampshire Foundation, who fund for populations below 50,000. This is called hyperlocal, and I say this because I've been to presentations in other countries and across the US where other areas, I won't say who, are very interested in just the big city daily newspapers. But in Texas, the newspapers that we receive are really representing the stories of people and of family members who were living in small towns who did not necessarily live in Dallas or Houston or San Antonio or Lubbock. So these newspapers are local. We aim to digitize, again, every single title in Texas if we could. And as you can see here in this example, I tried to pull newspapers that demonstrated the depth and breadth of Texas history and of Texas lives. These are every single newspaper represents the community reflection. It's our window into those historic communities and understanding how they lived, how they survived in a very rough area to be in before, of course, internet and air conditioning, and how they managed to grow their own communities. And these examples here come from small Texas cities, from schools, as well as if you see that pine needle, special interest groups who were trying to advocate for some cause. And in the case of the pine needle, they were publishing this newspaper to advocate for turning the big thicket piney woods, the big thicket forest, into a national park, and they were successful. Now I mentioned 1813, and this is a newspaper collection for the National Intelligencer that was contributed to us by a private collector. The National Intelligencer was published in Washington, D.C., and it covered a lot of the history, the battles that took place in San Antonio during the Mexican War for Independence from Spain. So these articles from 1813 actually cover that, and they are rich with names, with information, with locations of people. If you are interested in looking for that, when you go to the portal to Texas history, you can either search for San Antonio in the search engine, and you put that into quotation marks, or try Saint Antonio, ST period, because sometimes the newspapers covered it as Saint Antonio. And as you can see, newspaper searches are highlighted in yellow. And in this example, to pull this example for this presentation, I'd looked for Antonio and looked for the 1813 issues of the National Intelligencer. And as you can tell, there is some pretty elaborate and detailed coverage that the Intelligencer managed to receive and managed to print. I'm just so impressed by how how deeply detailed this is for a city that is way far over in the United States, because of course Texas was a part of Spain at this point, and able to gather that intelligence to publish this information. And if you look, it says the chief town of San Antonio, population only 7,000, which now I just kind of laugh about that, but um, it is a very good view. And I mentioned the local um, areas that we're able to recreate. Fairfield, Texas is a very small city, under 12,000 in population. And these issues cover things like, and this is my favorite topic, this is why I picked this, the building of libraries. Libraries have the history of libraries and newspapers. When you track that, you can see when a community, when it was first getting built, maybe a library wasn't a priority, but after it got established around 15 to 20 years after its population had grown and been established, people started to say, we need a library, we need books, we need to be able to organize something for our citizens to have access to materials. Um, this is a really good example, I think, in my opinion, of an understanding of how Texas communities grow and understanding what their interests are and their values and seeing how important the library is in a community. And I always try to pull some kind of a library example because I think it's, and just see it through the decades. And as you can tell, um, these are across 20 years of, first, we probably need to figure out what is spearheading it and maybe get money and get help to do this. And then going in, we learn a lot of names when we read this. We see a lot of people, uh, full names, often first, middle, surname. And they are also, we see all the people who contributed. They're a rich genealogical resource to tie a person to a town. And I always enjoy seeing that. And then I will again mention, I had plugged in Fairfield Public Library in quotation marks in the basic search engine of the portal Texas history. And as you can tell, these highlighted my search results. The portal highlights the search results in the newspapers, so it's very easy to spot. And now, in Fairfield, As you can tell, this was a lot of fun because the museum and library now, if anybody here is from Fairfield, Texas, you'll know this, are right next door to each other. They're a part of the same process. And these two groups partnered together to apply for a Tucker Foundation grant because the museum had the newspapers and the library could apply for the grant funding. And they're next door. And it just shows a wonderful collaboration that they completed 50 years after they joined forces. And I love that was something that happened. Another example, again, where you can track names and stories of maybe where people went, are how roads were built. Um, in Texas, those of you who are from Texas, you'll know this, we have I-35. But how extensive was I-35 and how did it come to be in some areas and who did it benefit? For example, the flooding was such a problem that it closed a lot of roads. This example is from Carrollton, Texas. And then a few years later, we have a new Hutton Branch Channel that was going to be a US Highway 77, which did eventually become I-35. So we're seeing this get built, seeing the interest in spreading the traffic and getting more people able to move around. And then we have the proposed expressway in Carrollton, and that is what's now I-35. So any of you who have driven in this area in DFW, you can see what's gone through. And again, this also helps us know, for example, track if your family was originally in an area south of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, you can maybe see why they moved, if they moved suddenly to the north. And you can find out, oh, okay, it was a little bit easier to migrate. It was easier maybe if they had farms to transport materials up and down the highway, where it wasn't an option before. But these are filling in puzzle pieces that we might not realize is why the causes of family changes and movement. So for the Texas Digital Newspaper Program, again, I mentioned 1813 to the present, and I'm just going to show you some interesting time periods. And I wanted to give you another example of Saint Antonio. And again, if you have very, very early family members from Texas, this 1813 issue, for instance, has multiple names and not just the example that I pulled, but you can go through and look at these issues and get an idea of, okay, maybe my family surname is here and maybe this is where I can follow them. And these issues trace different people going to different areas depending on how the revolution from Spain occurred. And these newspapers span, we have a lot of newspapers covering the Texas War for Independence from Mexico, and then Texas statehood, which are very valuable for understanding what happened and who participated. And again, the names in these newspapers, for instance, this Alex Russell and these trunks um, for a team, um, these are helpful for knowing what happened to our ancestors. For example, I helped a researcher locate their ancestor because he had lost books in the Texas Revolution, and he was a bookseller, and he posted an ad in the newspaper to locate the books after a different battles had happened. And it's amazing to be able to, well, we know their names, but to be able to feel hear their voices saying, I'm a book collector, or a bookseller, I'm trying to locate the books from my bookstore because I need to locate these. Can you please help me? I'm offering a reward. And you can see how much money they offered, and you can get an idea of, okay, these were fairly wealthy people, affluent. They were willing to give money for the bookstore. But it was just really interesting too, just to know I could feel, for instance, for the person I was helping research this, I could feel that feeling that their ancestor had of, I need to get my books back. I'm trying to find these. And of course, the Civil War. We have a lot of newspapers that cover the Civil War and go into great detail. And if you aren't sure about where your If your family members happen to be somewhere in Texas or were fighting in the South, you will find a lot of information in the Texas newspapers about that. The World War One newspapers are especially interesting for genealogical research because a lot of the soldiers who came through Texas rode on the railroads on the Katy train, and you can track their names going from one city to another on the train because often the newspapers published who the riders were, where they got off, where they were going, and where they served in the war. This is especially helpful to understand where someone might have been at really at any point in during the World War One years, to know what they were doing and when they might have come home and where they went. World War II, similarly, you can see this on the Katy train, the KTE train, but it's also very helpful to know on the World War II collection to see where people trained, because by that point we had some air bases set up, lots of training fields, and we do have a significant collection of military newspapers as well. And you can track through again the soldiers' names of who went where. Now, in addition to newspapers, we host all kinds of other materials on the portal Texas History. And what I really appreciate about the portal is that we can tie these together in our searches. And I'm going to give you a personal example from my own family history. When we conduct the searching, we can put in the surname of our family members, anything we're aware of that they had worked on or where they may have been. And for example, I know this was my great great uncle, and we have the Sturpies um, magazine on the Portal Texas History. And Sturpies, of course, is an extremely rich genealogical resource. I knew a little bit about my uncle based on this Sturpes entry, and based on the city directories of El Paso that we have, because I knew my great great uncle went through Galveston when he came in from Germany and drove across Texas, and it was in the late 1880s when he came through Germany. And then I found that he opened a baths. Well, baths back then were barber shops, not mani-pedi type of places, not as cool. They were barber shops. But he also owned a hotel. And this was later. I mentioned we're continually adding materials to both the Texas Digital Newspaper Program and to the Portal Texas History. But I had found him in Sturpies. I've found him in newspapers, and I'll show you an example of that in just a moment. And then later, just recently, actually about 3 years ago, I found a picture. His bath was actually a hotel. He had started it as a barber shop and then turned it into a hotel, and it's a Kramer hotel. And so I know exactly where this is, and I can look it up on Google Maps, which is so much fun. And I just love being able to see what that looked like. And then I also found, I mentioned the newspapers. I loved this entry of the silver wedding anniversary of Mr. F.E. Kramer and his wife, and that they were able to celebrate it in the Kramer Hotel. Um, and these are just the city directories where I was able to locate him. I wanted to let you know that we also are active partners in Chronicling America through the National Digital Newspaper Program funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. And we host the Gateway to Oklahoma history. If you have that one relative who may have gone up to Oklahoma or to Arkansas, check out Chronicling America and the Gateway to Oklahoma history. And you might just find that person. And thank you so much. I'm going to take questions now, if there are any questions.